What will be the price of a basket of tomatoes and other essential goods tomorrow? This question is perhaps one of the toughest to answer in Nigeria. This week, the National Bureau of Statistics released the Consumer Price Inflation Report for March 2025. Are prices of goods getting less or more volatile? Babajide Ogunsanwo, founder of Leadership by Data and Channels Television's data analyst, is right here to share more intelligence about the latest inflation trends. Babajide, great to have you again on the News at 10.
Good evening, today.
So very quickly, what's the good news from this inflation report?
Clearly, there's good news and there's bad news. In this report, like you've asked, the good news is if you find yourself living in rural Nigeria, the cost of living and the cost of food still is cheaper if you live in rural Nigeria compared to us that live in urban Nigeria. So the good news is for those families living and households living in rural Nigeria, cost of living is significantly better. However, the bad news from this inflation report is what is classified as the month-on-month inflation data. And by month-on-month inflation data, we're looking at prices of last month, prices in February compared to prices in March. And the National Bureau of Statistics says that is 3.9% month-on-month inflation. But the reason why that is classified as bad news, Ayotunde, is the last time we saw month-on-month inflation rate as high as 3.9% was about 2 decades ago. That's going back as far as July 2005. So a month-of-month inflation rate of 3.9% is anti-developmental, especially if you look at countries like France. Annual inflation, not month-on-month, annual inflation in France, less than 1%. In the United States, annual inflation, not month-on-month, 2.4%. In the United Kingdom, 2.6%. So what's the sort of price change that has happened in Nigeria within a month is what in developed economies happens in 12 months. That's the month-on-month perspective. However, let's take a look at other perspectives to understand this inflation report, especially if we look at it from a year-to-date perspective, a year-on-year perspective, and a 12-month average. However, all those numbers are still in double digits. The year-on-year inflation rates as at the end of March 2025, last month, compared to 12 months earlier, average prices have risen by 24%. Same thing even if you do the 12-month average, 29%. In summary, double-digit inflation rate is significantly anti-development. So this inflation rate is still anti-development.
Interesting. So is food getting cheaper, Babajide? And of course, where is the most affordable place to live in Nigeria right now?
This report doesn't clearly tell us where is the most affordable place to live in Nigeria. However, this report gives us some information about the states and the zones where families are seeing prices, especially food prices, change. Let's take a look at some of that data, especially if we aggregate it to just give us an understanding of exactly which zones are perhaps feeling more of the heat compared to other zones. And if we take a look at that data, looking at the geopolitical zones, even though we understand that their consumption patterns are different, it allows us to clearly see that northwest Nigeria, Ayotunde, 25% annual food inflation compared to this time last year. We see in the south, it's 16%. But the reason why the northwest 25% annual inflation rate is such a big deal is because of politics. We're getting close to the political season, and we know that the Northwest Zone is where the numbers were. In 2023, 6.6 million votes in the presidential election. The APC got only 40% of those votes, and the food inflation report of 25% from the Northwest are not the sort of numbers that the ruling party wants to have going into the election campaign window that is coming.
So, Babajide, as we round off, there is a national emergency really on food security, and we understand the government's outlook is on irrigation and, of course, water resource infrastructure. Now, what do you think? Will these structures actually significantly assist, to improve agricultural output?
We can look at that from the long-term, medium-term, and short-term. This will help if there's sincerity of purpose in the long term. Irrigation, water resource management, if we see sincerity of purpose in the implementation in the long term, it will help. However, in the medium term, let's take a look at the data and what states and the state governments and local governments should be doing to assist agricultural output and security in the medium term. Look at where the concentration of Nigeria's 25.3 million agricultural workers are. The evidence we have today shows that approximately half of those in Nigeria's agricultural sector live in the northwest and north central. 70% of those we classify as agricultural workers, farmers, herders, fishery, 70% of them, of these workers, live in northern Nigeria. So what we've seen is southern Nigeria just consuming, and we've seen most of that production being left to northern Nigeria. So in the medium term, we need to see states and local governments create policies and programs to promote investments that go beyond subsistence farming in southern Nigeria. And clearly, we also then need to be able to use the data to plan security operations and to plan various production subsidies that the state governments think they want to do. So in the long term, yes, irrigation, yes, water resource management. In the medium term, we need the states to look at the data and clearly see where they fall in the ranking of agricultural employees. But Ayotunde, perhaps the immediate term is what Nigerians are talking about. What should the government, or what should we do in the immediate term? And you know, Easter, and clearly Easter and despair do not mix, just like oil and water don't mix. Silence and justice do not mix. What I'm saying now today is open grazing and subsistence farming does not mix. So we clearly need to understand that open grazing and subsistence farming, just like Easter and despair, do not mix. Today.
I would definitely leave it at that. Babajide Ogunsanwo, thank you so much for your thoughts and analysis again on the News at 10.
Happy Easter Sunday.
Happy Easter.